Thank you very much for your very interesting question. I think it was so interesting that maybe I will wait with my questions for later. Please, now time for the audience to join.
Question: do you have enough evidence to prosecute individuals in China for the atrocities that were done in the Uyghurs?
That's a very interesting question, and to answer it I must give a certain amount of detail about one in particular of the crimes, and that is the crime of genocide, which excites people most. The crime of genocide requires a couple of things to be proved. One is that something's done, in this case measures to control birth, but the other is that it is done by the perpetrator, the offender, with the intent to destroy a protected group as such, in whole or part as such. But components, but what you're concerned with is the mental state of the doer, the mental state of the perpetrator. Intent to destroy. The word destroy is not defined in the convention. A protected group, well, the Uyghurs are a protected group, in whole or part, and the question of how big a part is always present. And then the words as such appear at the end, and that means for them it has to do with the group. But how do you prove the intention if, for example, you were able to pursue a government, which you're not, because you have to pursue individuals in all the international courts. But what intent would you have to prove as against the government? Well, it would be very difficult, because if you've got a cabinet table with 10 ministers stuck around it, and they reach a decision on killing all the prisoners or sending them all to Siberia or something where they're going to die, whatever it might be, you don't know what the individual mental states of all those people are. Their mental intentions may have been different, but the decision may have been the same. So it's always very difficult when looking at what is a composite decision to find the mental element. Where you have a high level of personal control, as for example in the Yugoslav case with either Mladic or Karadzic or even Milosevic, where you have a very high level of personal control, it's much more possible that you will find the evidence showing that mental state. Now, in the Uyghur tribunal, we had a lot of evidence from experts, one in particular who's a very well-known expert, regularly attacked, called Adrian Zenz, Z-E-N-Z. And he's attacked because he's a right-wing fundamentalist Christian. So there we are, all sorts of bad cards according to many characterizations, but it doesn't matter. His academic research is very clearly peer-reviewed and impeccable. Nobody's actually blown a hole in his research. In the end, we had 2 evidence hearings with witnesses in person, and at the second one, somebody came up to me and handed me something on terms of complete secrecy as to where it came from. So I can't tell you, and I won't. When we were able to look at what was within it, it became clear that this was a level of documents, if genuine, secret at the highest level of categorization, and these were secret speeches made by President Xi. So we went through a process in a short time, because this was close to the day when judgment had to be delivered, or we wanted to deliver judgment. And these documents were reviewed by Adrian Zenz and 2 other independent academics, and they all came and gave evidence about these documents. And these documents, long history reaching an answer to your question, it might be thought, if for example you had a criminal trial with all the usual paraphernalia of judges or a jury, it might be thought that these documents would show the necessary mental state in the top leadership of the Communist Party.
Are you talking about the online tribunal? The evidence was.
Yeah, the evidence had to be. We'd run out of resources in the sense that we just couldn't put together another live hearing. The evidence was given online, but it was also still open and public. Yes.
Yeah.
For human rights.
Thank you. I have a question. So, the documents and outcomes from Uyghur Tribunal.
Can't hear you, right?
Sorry. So the documents and outcomes from Uyghur Tribunal might be maybe somewhere in future be a good base for international community.
Yeah. We have promised that the documents we've had and used, and so far as possible, and we hope it will be possible, the documents that were gathered together as part of the base of documents from which a fair selection was made will be accessible. Of course, making documents accessible for a long period of time is now quite difficult and expensive because it is necessarily an electronic record. And so we are in the business of discussions with established universities, whether a university will want to hold the documents on the basis that the documents will be fully available to the public. And we don't want it to be difficult for the public to get there. We want it, because it's a people's tribunal, it's not written in the language of academics, still less is it written in the language of lawyers, who would probably have you asleep by the end of the first page if they could. It's written in language to be understood, but that also means that if the reader who wants to learn more says, I want to find out what's there, the reader's got to be able to go to a footnote, and from the footnote by hyperlink or otherwise to get straight to the source material. So it's a very big and quite difficult exercise. And of course we don't have any funds apart from what we can raise or what is given by the World Uyghur Congress.
This is a challenge for the Oriental Institute.
Okay, next question, please. Anyone? Please.
Maybe, Sir Geoffrey, if you don't mind me asking, are you ever worried that the results of the ruling might be hijacked for some certain diplomatic agenda or by a government or just generally somebody using it for their own purpose?
Well, I think you have to, if you engage in this sort of public space work, you've got to have that in mind. But at the moment, I can't see how it could be hijacked for improper purposes. If you read the judgment, which is not very long, 63 pages, you'll find a lot of stuff that's fair or even favourable to the People's Republic of China. It's not a savage attack. It explains the analysis of the evidence. It explains why one or two witnesses were not accepted. So I think it would be fairly hard for it to be used as for devious purposes, or even used as ad hominem attacks on me and my 8 colleagues. And indeed the ad hominem attacks have now died down. They're attacking the judgment in different ways. So, very sensible point, but I think we're okay, but wait and see.
Kateřina Procházková, synopsis.
Thank you. Sir Geoffrey, let me ask one question. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know what procedure is needed to bring the whole case of genocide in Sin-ťiang to International Court of Justice or International Court in Hague.
Well, it's a really important and relevant question for you as citizens of the world, because you probably think, until you hear people like me speaking with such gloom and despair about the real world, you rather hope there's a legal system out there that looks after you in the way that the local policeman outside the building will look after you, and it's just not like that. The answer to your question is only with good fortune or extreme difficulty. And it's much likely to be, unless and until the regime in China completely changes, it's likely to be the same as it's been for consideration of Russia's killings of mass people in the interbellum, or America in the war, or America and the atomic bomb, or Britain and the bombing of Dresden. It's likely to be impossible. Technically, the answer is this. As to those two courts, the International Court of Justice might be approached by another country, saying to the International Court of Justice, here's a treaty. China has signed the treaty. It's bound by the treaty. And we've managed to find a way of saying, there's a breach. Will you deal with it? Unfortunately, two things. One, China has a reservation. And the reservation is, we will not be subject to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice for breaches of this convention. And that's quite possibly the end of the matter. So it's completely defended. And even if it wasn't, there aren't that many countries that are going to have the guts, the courage, to try and take China to the International Court of Justice. So far as the International Criminal Court, for those of you who don't know, it's a so-called permanent court, but if you look at the map of how much of the world it covers, it's probably on one of those slides, but it'll take me a bit too long to find it. It's only a small portion of the world that is subject to the International Criminal Court. Russia, China, America, India, no, they're not involved at all. And therefore, at first sight, you can't get somebody before that court. If you could get anyone before that court, it would only be by chance circumstances. You first of all have to have enough evidence against the individual. The individual will have to somehow fall into the jurisdiction of a country which could hand him over to the court. And so far as the China leadership is concerned, that is not going to happen. There are mechanisms for getting situations involving international crimes to the International Criminal Court, but they require you to get through the Security Council. And guess who's got a veto on the Security Council?
Please, Mr. Peterborough.
Thank you. Maybe a few points that are linked to what Katarina was asking. There are issues in international law, and I'm not a specialist, but I wonder whether China could, for example, invoke the immunity of a sovereign power.
Yeah.
Although in Nuremberg, I think, in the Nuremberg trial after the Second World War, this was punctuated completely, and yeah. I don't know how much it was.
No, if you were able to get it to the court, that defence wouldn't run, but you just can't get it to the court in the first place.
And the second thing, from another angle, could China be accused of making impossible putting obstacles to the Uyghurs' right to self-determination?
Probably, but not in a way that's going to sound in any of these courts that will be effective. There are probably a number of other conventions breached by China, child slavery probably, and others, but the avenues for making complaints are to different bodies, and they're much more modest in reach, and they're much easier just to get forgotten. And China's never going to take any notice. We have to live in the real world where public perception is going to drive governments to act and nothing else. And it just so happens, and it is a happening, that the Uyghurs gained huge public following despite not being the Holocaust, despite not being mass killings. Got huge attraction, and it so happens that a finding of genocide is the one thing that might make a government do something. And that reminds me of something I told you I'd tell you about, and we'll have to come back to. But so these other mechanisms, and they're listed in about page 4 or 5 or 6 of the judgment. You can find them, and I think I copied them, or they were copied from another opinion, but it doesn't matter. They're there. There are a number of mechanisms that could be used, but they would not have the impact. And you have to be realistic. If you're doing this sort of thing, the gap you fill has to be one that's going to be usable. the more bits you add on, by the way, it could also be guilty of this and guilty of that, and so on. You dilute the effect. This is a simple statement that is of value to others and should have an effect on governments. But you trigger me to remember, you remind me to mention, did I mention already? There is one government that has pronounced on genocide. Did I tell you that? It's the United States of America. And it was very strange. On the second to last day of office, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo suddenly announced, we were partway through our work by then, suddenly announced genocide. Bit of a surprise. He was out of office 2 days later. And to our even greater surprise, incoming Democrat Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, I agree. So, of course, we got out our quill pens, wrote off to the American embassy, please can we have the evidence and please can we have the reasoning for your making a finding of genocide, because it seems to us quite important. Result, silence. So America has announced a finding of genocide, has not given the reasons for it, has not said on which of the 5 bases of fact genocide is proved, and therefore is difficult to apply, plus the fact that although it's done various things by way of sanctions against China, it has never said we're doing this responsive to our Article 1 undertaking, Article 1 of the Genocide Convention undertaking. It's all very messy.
And one last point, which leads to a hypothetical question, but you mentioned some precedents concerning individual state actors being prosecuted under universal prosecution.
Not being protected, being vulnerable.
Being vulnerable, well.
Yeah.
You have mentioned the case of General Pinochet, who was held in Britain for a while and was prosecuted in Spain. But you did mention the example of the Iranian former minister, I think, who was arrested in
Stockholm.
Is on trial in Sweden. Would you want to use that as a precedent and act in a similar way, or would there be governments you think that would act in a similar way towards, for example, President Xi? Because you said that there's evidence that he invoked or that he favored genocide directly, personally, in his secret speeches and so on. So there is evidence about him being involved in genocide, and therefore, if he would be arrested on Stockholm Airport if he comes for a safe visit.
Yes, I mean it's an exciting contemplation, isn't it? That it would happen, and maybe a citizen, one of you would go along and try and arrest him as a citizen. Maybe technically possible, practically impossible, either because he would be able to invoke in those circumstances, if he was travelling on diplomatic business, diplomatic immunity. He has not in fact left the country for a very long time.
He knows.
Next question, please. Sorry, I don't know your name.
When talking about countries that may have guts, right, to approach this question, if there is any Islamic state that somehow approached your conclusion, I doubt that there is no state that...
Well, the immediate neighbouring states are all friendly to China because of their interest in the Belt and Road Initiative that runs through their territory. So I don't think they're going to do very much with it. Is that the answer to your question?
Maybe Turkey. I was interested in Turkey, actually.
Oh, I see what you're... No, I think I know what you're saying is there a country that might do what the Gambia did? That's right. Well, there might be. But even if you could find such a... So for those of you who don't know, or don't know about this, it was always thought that Myanmar was immune from pursuit in the courts for its treatment of the Rohingya Muslims, just simply because it had too many powerful friends in the form of China and Russia. And then the tiny little state of the Gambia brought an action against it at the International Court of Justice, and Myanmar had to go there and appear. It appeared actually through Aung San Suu Kyi, representing the generals. I mean, it's a curious world. She's now, of course, in house arrest, or at least under arrest. Yes, so the Gambia did it. And the Gambia did it, I think, because it was funded or asked to do it by the Muslim Congress or the Muslim Council, I think, in Africa. So the answer to your question is theoretically, maybe. But can you think of a country that would take on not just Myanmar, but the People's Republic of China, where the People's Republic of China has a legal reservation that says there's nothing you can do about this? And I suppose it's possible that you could find arguments for saying the reservation shouldn't work, but it's pretty unlikely.
If I may fill in specifically on Turkey, Turkey has been kind of keeping a balance of, on the one hand, tolerating presence of a very sizable Uyghur diaspora on its territory, but at the same time not doing really any factual steps against China. I think they have declared on one of the last sessions of the United Nations that they are critical of the situation inside East Turkestan, and that they keep watching the situation, but they have not joined the international movement and also not have raised the issue, for example, at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, etc. So Turkey, with the most numerous Uyghur diaspora, but with very strong claims to Turkic or intra-Turkic, pan-Turkic solidarity, has not fulfilled its obligations. And as far as I can hear from my Uyghur friends in Turkey, the keyword of Turkish communication with its Uyghur population is please be patient. Sabır to them. Next question. Mr. Brock, please.
One organizational question. Have your trial institutions or have your trial groups been in contact with such institutions as the UN Commission on Human Rights or Amnesty International? Has there been any cooperation?
Oh, yes. In reverse order. Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and various other groups of lawyers and others had prepared reports on the situation in Xinjiang. They were all invited to come and help with evidence. They all declined except one, which was the New Lines report, which is a composition of many people. It's a rather curious report, but they very nicely flew themselves over to London and gave evidence, and they tried to help. We were very grateful to them for that. We didn't actually accept their approach to the law or to the proof of facts, which we thought was far too lenient, far too easy. We wanted something stricter. There's another, by the way, for any of you interested, another really good report called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, which came out after the evidence hearings, so we were unable to, there just simply wasn't time to get them to come and give evidence. We cited their report quite a lot in the judgment, and I think of all the reports of that kind of body, it's probably the most valuable one. And it's very, very valuable and really quite testing of one's imagination when it deals with the circumstances in which, it deals with it by field research, people on the ground, and it deals with the question of how families are dealt with when somebody was detained. As you possibly know, and perhaps I should have mentioned this, I mean, one of the problems is the Uyghurs were just swept up off the streets, more or less, and shoved into detention for significant periods of time, and then either released on the basis that they'd been converted or terrified into behavior, or sent to long-term prison. But the ASPI report analysed a large cache of leaked documents, loads of leaked documents in this case, and the leaked documents were police reports. Another woman called Yale Grau, also you can look up, she looked into it, these reports. And these reports show the nature of surveillance And depending on your viewpoint, you can think it's quite strange or quite frightening. When somebody's, this man, the local village, the most local, what's it called? The most local level of community activity.
Village, yeah.
Sorry?
Village.
It's the village. And so the man goes off to detention, and the Communist Party reps are into the house 3 times a week, finding out what the emotional reaction of the family is, whether they're stable, whether they're hostile, and everything else. And you think, well, are they doing this for the good? Is that even conceivably possible? You've got to think that. Or are they just doing it because they really want to have this maximum level of understanding of control of somebody, his family, and he's ultimately going to be released? So the Aspie report is very good. There's another report which also came out a bit too late, and it's quite an important report from our point of view, because it has to do with the use of genocide as a term. Genocide is a highly emotive term. It's used very inaccurately by people all around the world. It usually doesn't follow the legal definition. But most important, it really is rooted in the Holocaust of the Jews. And so when we found ourselves looking, as we were, at an allegation of genocide that was not mass killing, we thought, well, amongst other things, we should probably be sensitive to the Jewish interest. And indeed, I had a very long and really very pleasant and interesting long conversation with the chief rabbi in England. And I said, would you help us by coming and, perhaps giving the Jewish conception of Holocaust so that we don't find ourselves speaking without relevant knowledge? And he declined, but I could completely understand that. But the Washington Holocaust Museum did publish a report in which it found fairly and squarely genocide on a wider basis than we found. So we felt that we weren't running the risk of being discourteous to or causing offence to the Jewish community, which was a happy aside. That report is interesting, but the one to read, probably Human Rights Watch report, is pretty good. That's got a lot of groundwork, field work, and the Aspie, Australian Strategic Policy Initiative, or whatever it's called. Yeah.
Next question. Mr. Brott. Prosim, please.
One more point. When you say that that your group or the People's Tribunal applies law, do you mean 2 sources of law, international law and Chinese?
No, only international law. These are international crimes, and therefore we're applying international law, but it's international law to which the People's Republic of China is itself committed, because it is, just like Great Britain and the United States of America, somebody who's acceded to the convention.
But its own internal norms, Chinese domestic laws, are not your main concern.
No, not at all. I mean, not dismissively. It's just that, again, if you start going down a byway and saying, oh, by the way, their domestic law would be, and by the way, everything's diluted. Sharp focus, conservative conclusions.
Please.
I have one more question. So the Uyghur Tribunal judgment was done. There was done also a few reports, but what now? So what we could do now? How for example, normal people like us could use a judgment, or what kind of movement we could do? Because
I'm not going to tell you, and you know that when you ask me the question, because you had lunch with me. But no, it's up to you. It's not up to us. No more is it up to us to tell governments or NGOs or the UN what to do. It's not up to us to tell you what to do. If you feel, you as individuals feel you have a duty to your fellow citizens anywhere in the world, if you do, and if you feel that what you now know should be taken into account by you, then what are you going to do about it? Well, you can start at the lowest level. T-shirt, cotton, Sin-ťiang. Are you going to buy it? In light of what you may know from the Tribunal and from elsewhere about where the majority of cotton comes from and whether it's produced by slave labor. You have a choice. Boycotting has gone on for centuries. It's not always very successful. Sometimes it does have an effect. But if that's not enough and you're still worried about it, it's up to you to decide what you're going to do. There aren't any nursemaids around. In the discharge of your duty, it's personal. On one view. You can't walk away from it. And if you don't like the idea that duty is personal, just think about this. Who are your immediate neighbours? Well, there's Slovakia. Who comes next, going round the corner? Slovakia, Slovakia, Austria, Germany, Poland. Right, that'll do. Russia, but no, not Russia. Not yet. Ukraine. So if something really terrible was happening in one of those countries, if, for example, and these things are not impossible, if, for example, you knew that in one of those countries the government was popping Muslims into gas ovens, would you say, bah, so what? I won't bother to drive through the country. I'll find a route round it to go to my holiday destination. Is that what you do? Or would you say, no, I've got to do something. I've got to make my government do something. I've got to do something. That's the question you have to ask yourself, because geographical distance makes no difference if you conceive of the world as a single family of humanity and your neighbour the other side of the world, the equivalent to your neighbour in Latvia, Austria, Germany. It's a matter for you.
Okay, I have a question also, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
Regarding the Uyghur Tribunal, a more specific question is how did the Tribunal determine the intent to destroy, in part, in whole, the group as such?
Well, indeed, we determined the intent in the usual way. First of all, documents are very helpful. And here you had not just the late produced secret document speeches of President Xi, but you also had earlier documents explaining what the policy was in the region once the persecution of the Uyghurs began, and in particular the express purpose in relation to control of births. You then have not just a localized practice happening just in one town or one village, but you have a consistency of practice in different places where the witnesses are not connected, so they're just speaking independently. And in combination, you therefore have written words, sometimes spoken words, but not very often, consistency of practice, and policy documents of a general kind, and it's possible to reach that conclusion. It's dealt with in some detail at the end, towards the end of the judgment.
Okay. So even though, in contrast, for example, with the Holocaust, when we have verbal expressions or euphemisms such as the final solution, etc., there is no such comparatively direct language in the official Chinese documents, but given on the existing relatively milder formulations of the Chinese newspeak and the practice and the stated goals, that was a sufficient basis for the ruling.
By stated goals, do you mean the goals of homogenization of the people? Or,
yes, and the fusion.
Forced assimilation.
Yes.
Yes. Of course, we had to consider, for those of you who haven't thought about this, assimilation of nations, disappearance of nations, is something that happens all the time. It will have happened in your bit of Europe, and it's happened in our little country over there as well. But when it happens naturally, it's no crime. But when it happens as a result of extraordinary, dramatic decline, provable by statistics of various kinds, dramatic decline in what there would have been population of the Uyghurs, let's do it that way, like that, and you suddenly find it's like that, then you have to account for this gap, and you have to account for the purpose behind it. And it is to that, I meant to add that piece of evidence, the statistical evidence coupled with the stated purposes in the documents are quite enough to prove the intention to by birth control measures to reduce the population in whole or part, not all, of the Uyghur population. This is not, and has never been suggested to be, an attempt to wipe out the Uyghur population, not at all. Indeed, on the contrary, to some extent, where you get evidence of Han Chinese men being encouraged to marry Uyghur women, it's rather the reverse in a way. But nevertheless, the evidence of the intention to reduce, and the, indeed, although it's not material, the evidence that it's actually happening, that you're really reducing the number of births that there would have been, that was sufficient for the intention.
And I also think some of the keywords of the political Chinese political language are also quite clear. Like one of the last keywords for the policies, I don't know how they translate it, Jiao Wang, Jiao Liu, Jiao Run. So it's like interaction, contact, and fusion of nationalities. The Run character, amalgamation being written with the cauldron radical, which means melt together. Two components which then become inseparable. It means bronze vessel.
Yeah,
right?
that's
So
why I translated amalgamation.
Amalgamation, slianie narodov. In Russian ethnic nationality theory, this term is called slianie narodov. Just like the amalgam, the rune, meaning the tin and the copper becoming bronze together, not being able to separate. So I think the connotations here can be also quite clear, actually, from the language and script itself. Okay. Any more questions from the audience? Yes, please.
And this is the last
I would
one.
like to ask if the tribunal on Uyghurs, if it has ended, like, or if you're going still to collect some information, more evidences, if the job is still going on.
No, we probably not. And you have to do something. You either have to be in continual session, and I'm afraid that was not going to be possible. Neither Nick Vetch nor me nor our 7 senior professors were necessarily going to allocate the time for a future thing. Plus the fact that it's a huge business to be sure you're on top of the evidence as it unfolds. So we froze at a certain point of time and collected everything we could, and we make our decision on the basis of that. And it's now up probably to the World Uyghur Congress to make sure that it is keeping information up to date in the same way. And this is a question that arises already in relation to the China Tribunal's findings about forced organ harvesting. People do ask, well, is it still going on? To which the answer is there is actually some evidence that it may be, and it may actually be getting worse. And it may be getting worse because of the Uyghurs being used. There's a very horrible line of evidence that we did not rely on, allowing for that possibility. But for that, you have to go to WUK to ask them what's the up-to-date evidence. And if further action is taken by anyone to bring things up to date, well, that'll be for whoever is doing it. But our work has to be frozen at a certain point of time. It is. Sorry, is this gentleman next?
Yes, please, last question.
I'm Czech Wikipedian.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
I'm Czech Wikipedian, and I have translated several articles, including that on Ujgurské Tribunal, and I have read lots of newspaper articles and given testimonies, and I found it very depressing. And how do you cope yourself with hearing so many testimonies on atrocities that are going on?
Well, it's very nice of you to ask how I cope with the distress, and I appreciate it. And you will have to accept the seeming hard-hearted answer that it doesn't really worry me at all. And that doesn't mean I'm a monster. I mean, I may be a monster, but I hope not. It just means that if you do this sort of work, you have to detach yourself. And so when I was an ordinary, criminal lawyer or lawyer doing criminal cases or a judge, and you open the pictures and there's the dissected body of the woman who the man's just whatever, you have to learn to set that aside, because if it would worry you, your judgment would go. And so I suspect that the lawyer dealing with this sort of work, just like the surgeon dealing with, on the operating table, the little baby whose life is in his hands, the last thing he dares do is allow to enter into his thinking the social and family consequences of things going wrong. He just has to be sure that things are done to the best of his ability. That's all I can say.